Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I would love to welcome you to Quality by Design for IRT or RTSM and how we can work together to build smart protocols from the very start. I have two incredibly special speakers joining us today. Our featured speaker is Ana-Zeralda Canals Hamann, who brings deep experience across the full spectrum of clinical trial operations. She spent over 16 years on the sponsor side, leading everything from clinical ops to supply chain, regulatory, CMC, and even preclinical services. Ana-Zeralda holds a PhD from Oxford and an MSc in clinical research administration, and she's currently Associate Director of Clinical Trial Supply at Debiopharm. She's an active voice in the clinical supply community. She helps lead discussions as part of GCSG's European Committee and also a chairwoman of their Knowledge Forum. Also joining us today is Chuck Harris, who brings decades of hands-on experience improving how clinical trials are designed and executed. Chuck began his career as a biomedical engineer and FDA medical device investigator, which gives him deep insight into regulatory expectations from the inside. And since then, he's helped shape the RTSM industry, most notably as former CEO of Endpoint Clinical, and now as founder and COO of Korio, where he's focused on building smarter, faster ways to support randomization and trial supply from day one. So thank you both very much for being here. And with that, I'll pass the controls over to you, Anna. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure presenting today together with Chuck. In today's agenda, we will be introducing a bit what quality by design is, the fundamentals of RTSM or IRT, designing smarter protocols, implementation of the quality by design in the IRT setup, then a few case studies and best practices, and then also future directions and innovations. And of course, at the very end, we'll go a bit through all the different questions that you might have that pop up. So what is quality by design and what the principles of quality by design is? So quality by design can be a framework that emphasizes the quality mindset in development. So ensuring that we have consistent quality outcomes. So the idea is to prepare better protocols that have better quality and that provide us all the information and make us a bit more flexible when we're designing. So we don't have to always go back to protocol amendments. We have to think about it at the very beginning, try to make the best protocol out of it, and then take it forward. We also have to have critical quality attributes. So we have to have critical thinking for when we design our protocols. So we have to identify that criticality, which is therefore vital for monitoring and controlling product quality during development. And we have to understand what the process is. So we have to understand how it works to be able to use it in an efficient way. And then we have to have a control strategy to understand what we're doing and maintaining that quality throughout and monitoring that quality and making adequate adjustments.
From a IRT or RTSM perspective, anything that we can do earlier in the process to build quality in to the outcome is going to be better for us as a provider. It'll be better for the sites and for you as a sponsor. And so I think the theme of our conversation today is having more thought and having the right stakeholders at the table earlier can de-risk trial go live and operation. And so, anything that we can do as a provider, and I think for any other e-clinical provider to have a little bit earlier input in the process is going to contribute downstream to the quality outcome.
So the importance of quality by design in clinical trials. So it's making our trials more efficient. So implementing quality by design early on, as Chuck has mentioned, helps to streamline processes and also optimize resources. A lot of the times, if you start earlier, you already get into the flow of making the processes more efficient, and you're able to be more flexible when you have to change things. It provides higher quality results. So it ends up having better patient outcomes and it enhances medicine. And there's also a reduction in risk. So you already start discussing the protocol early on with your different stakeholders. Therefore, every risk or issue might arise early on, and it's easier to implement it or make a change early on than make a change later on. And then, of course, the better quality, the better regulatory approval. So it increases also the likelihood of gaining regulatory approval and maintaining compliance.
So as a RTSM provider, we're positioned to really partner with the sponsor and mirror all of the requirements the sponsor needs to fulfill with the ultimate goal of a regulatory submission and approval. So along that pathway, we're going to take it upon ourselves and be accountable for understanding at the deepest level possible what a given protocol's objectives are, right? We want to understand the endpoints. We want to understand the patient and site experience. We want to know how the simple things like how is the drug going to be packaged? What is known about the stability of the investigational product? How often are the site interactions with the system going to be for assigning additional drug? What are the type of requirements around dose assignments? Is it more investigator discretion and more of a flexible kind of RTSM experience, or will the system think about things and calculate doses and have a more sort of rigid implementation of that protocol? The more that we can understand all of those details upfront, the more success that we'll have in supporting the sponsor's ultimate goal of submitting for that approval. But then what we find is that asking maybe some of those questions that do seem simple, straightforward in an earlier phase of things before even what the protocol is final and approved, it can often unearth maybe misalignment or a different understanding of the mechanics of a given trial that could ultimately cause maybe a disruption or up to and requiring a protocol amendment to accommodate certain real world scenarios that discussion with IRT around supply chain logistics could just maybe surface much earlier in the conversation.
So let's dig in a bit into how to design smarter protocols. So identifying the key areas of impact is one of the most important parts. So we have listed a few of these. So for example, as Chuck has mentioned, patient screening and recruitment. How will that impact? Is the drug formulation and packaging impacting, or are we spacing out patient screening and recruitment? Also very important is, do we trigger clinical trial supplies, for example, at screening or at randomization, or do we have to provide it before the patient even appears? So do we do supply planning before at site initiation, for example? It also depends on what your drug is and how that is influenced. You have to take into consideration the trial logistics, how supply chain issues can alter trial structure. Do you have, are there things you have to consider if there's going to be problems with travel? So are there airplane issues? Are there, in certain countries, is there a war? Do you have, so that might be also to consider, because then you might need to have a larger buffer. And therefore in the IRT, you need to open the window, the short window and the long window, make it more open. And those things you also have to consider implementing those into the protocol early on. You also have to think about compliance, the influence of supply ease on patient adherence. How is the way you're going to be scheduling your dose administrations? Is it going to be the patient is taking the products home with them? Is the patient taking the product at the hospital itself? Are we doing just-in-time labeling? Are we doing direct to patient? It's all these different ideas that you need to consider. Then you also have to consider safety monitoring. Is your rescue medication comparator, whatever you're dealing with, available? Are you going to have stock issues? Do you have to think about having different kit types in the system? Because if you don't consider all the different, for example, doses that are available for your rescue medication, and some become unavailable and you've only used 15 or 60 ml, but there's a 45 ml, and that's the one that you're going to need. It's also good to consider these things at protocol design, because you will need to include them in your IRT and implement them, maybe at a later stage. Sometimes they might be just for reducing the risk, and you might not need them, but it's worthwhile having them already for a later time. And the same is, how many cohorts have you planned? Do you know how many you're going to do? We've had a study where we were planning to do 6. We've ended up doing 15. So adding extra cohorts early on without knowing what the dose is, but you're able to add that dose later on, brings in that flexibility. And you might need to do a protocol amendment at a later stage, but in the IRT, you've already implemented that at the protocol design stage. So you don't have to make the changes later on and not be, for example, the factor that might delay the study, because you've already thought about all those areas that you might have an issue with. And then also regulatory compliance and adhering to global standards. That always has to be taken into consideration when you're designing the protocols at the very beginning. We then also have site selection, how global distribution challenges affect trial design. So you might have, but those countries, a country setup, and your recruitment isn't going well. So you end up having to add new countries. Were already included in your feasibility. So why weren't they included in your IRT design? Even though you might not have those sites open, but it might be useful to have that country open, and you just add the extra sites. It's also visit frequency, the balance between clinical need and logistical capabilities. Sometimes when you're designing the protocol and you're discussing with your medical monitors and the different team members, they might put the visit frequencies quite apart or quite close to each other, depending on the dose administrations. In that aspect, you might consider, do I do the first visit at site, but the next 2 visits will be at home? So you give the product for the patient to take home. How will that be implemented into the IRT? Do you implement the 3 visits, or do you just put 1 visit for dose administration and then they do the other visits at home? So these are things that you need to consider when you're designing the protocol. If you don't consider them at the very beginning and you consider them later on when you're designing the IRT, it might be too late. Bringing in the IRT early on and thinking about what you want to implement or how you want to design your IRT will also be very important. The patient kits, very important to decide how you want to do those and implement those. Do you want to do monodose, or are you going to use a 12-count bottle or a 100 vial kit? It is a balance between patient ease or site ease. So you also have to consider site centricity. Put yourself in the patient's and in the site's skin when you're designing your protocol, because you might think about your patient kits in a different way. It's not always what is best for us, but it's also what is best for the patient as well as for the site. If you do a 100 vial kit for a site and they don't, it depends if it's a site that has a hospital and has a site that has a pharmacy at a hospital, then it's easier because they have more space. But for example, in dialysis patients, you have a lot of dialysis sites, especially in the US, that are at a mall, and they don't tend to have very big freezers or fridges. So if you give them a 100 vial box that is very huge and takes up one of the shelves, you might get some issues with your sites where they say, could you please send me less because we're only going to have 2 or 3 patients. You do have to think about that when you're designing your protocol, and also how you're going to implement that in your IRT. And then the dosing regime. That's also always related to how your patient kits are designed. So are you going to be dosing 5 days a week, 3 days a week, once, and then your patient kit will be dependent on that. And you also have to think about stability. Do you have short expiry dates? Do you have different temperatures? So you might have a product, you have different products. One might be room temperature, one might be -60, and the other one might be -20. How are you controlling all this? Are you taking into consideration temperature auto resolution in your IRT, for example? Are you going to be managing all your temperature excursions in the IRT? How are you going to manage that with your quality team? All of those are things that you need to consider already at the protocol design stage. And you have to consider. I don't know, Chuck, have I missed anything that pops up to mind?
Yeah, well, I think everything you said is spot on. And some things that we see, I think, as a provider further downstream could also be some of the actual writing of the protocol as well. So sometimes when you are, right, we all know that for if RTSM and other e-clinical applications are software, and software receives requirements, right? You can basically implement anything as long as there's a requirement that could be written. And when we review a protocol, we might see ambiguous language around maybe the actual visit or dosing schedule versus the text that we might see further down in the actual protocol design. We might see some footnotes that have different exceptions or additional clarifications. Yet when we try to distill those into a series of rules or logic or need to clarify, what we can find is that there's just maybe some misunderstandings between perhaps the clinical operations, supplies, biostats. It could really be across different groups within a given sponsor about the intent for how this protocol is actually going to work in the field. And so that's an example of literally just really focusing on every single word in a protocol and trying to pick it apart to create something like an IRT system requirements document. That can lead to some very interesting discussions, which could maybe lead to some changes within IRT. It could lead to a change maybe within EDC or another application, but it could also go all the way downstream to a conversation about site selection and patient recruitment. It could go into manufacturing, packaging. So yeah, we see every sort of possible level of potential way to help, again, de-risk or clarify a protocol when we finally get our hands on it.
I absolutely agree. So, as we've touched the risk management and mitigation strategies, so if we design smart protocols and start the design early on with plenty of time, we're already identifying potential risks. So the first step is to effectively go through risk management to identify potential risks that could impact our project. It's a good time to do it early on because you will already see what issues you might have. And then it's implementing those mitigation plans. So once the risks have been identified, implement the mitigation plans early to help address any risks proactively so that you're not reacting to them, but you've addressed them proactively and can either minimize them or avoid them. And therefore, this leads to minimizing disruptions during the trial and makes the whole protocol and study more smooth and the outcomes coming out better. So ensuring protocol flexibility and adaptability. So how do we do this? So if we design flexible protocols, we then accommodate for the challenges, and then we maintain trial integrity. So how do we do that? When we're designing protocols, one of the flaws that we have a lot of the times is that we design the protocols locking us in to a lot of areas, and we don't bring flexibility into the study, and therefore it makes us non-adaptable. So protocols need to be designed as flexible as possible. So if you are going to use a comparator, don't specify what manufacturer you're going to be using, because you're already locking yourself in. If you're using a certain dose of it, try to include all the different doses available so that the sites can choose what they have available at hand, or if there's a stock out, or if there's a low stock in the global market, then it'll be easier to provide that product. So those are a few examples. But in discussions with your IRT vendors and because sometimes it's the IRT vendor, sometimes it's your CRO, sometimes it's your CDMO. It's really getting all your stakeholders on board early, because I'm pretty sure that most of you have very good relationships with your IRT vendor, with your preferred CDMOs, with your preferred CROs. We have to cultivate that relationship with them to find the most appropriate collaboration. And one of them is by including them in how to design your protocol. So they might have a lot of experience in the IRT or in the therapeutic disease or area that you're working on. And they might have had studies that have had similar issues to you. So it's always good to let them provide their input and provide their experience, which might be different because they might be looking at the protocol in a different way to you, or the past experience might be really useful because a previous protocol that was designed or that was set up had this issue. So you were able to avoid that issue happening twice. So do have that relationship with your stakeholders. Listen to what they have to say. I know that a lot of the times we come to our vendors and we say, we want it this way and we want it done that way. But a lot of the times it's good to say, this is how we would like to do it. What do you have to say? How would you do it? Because a lot of the times we focus on what we want to do, but we don't see sometimes outside of the box. So think outside the box and give your vendors that opportunity to provide input and provide their experience, because at the end of the day, that's also what we're paying for.
I would just echo everything that you're saying. We do, frequently find ourselves in conversations, with maybe a protocol synopsis, right? So there's a general idea of where things are going to go, right? For different companies, there may be one molecule, right? There might be one trial. It could be, they're not drawing maybe from experience doing a trial of that design on that therapeutic, that same pool of people or other vendors. And maybe we've done it 100 times, right? We've seen it. We know it works. We know where the pitfalls might be. They might be from an IRT perspective. They might just be a general observation around the type of protocol amendments that will likely to become, based on something that we're seeing. It could literally be around just logistics. How is this particular type of kit going to be mixed at the pharmacy? And how is it getting logistically get to the patient or location that it needs to be by the time this next event has to occur within IRT or another system? And it's like, we can draw on all of that and at least offer some perspective based on maybe sheer volume of exposure to different clients and different sizes of studies of a similar, therapeutic area, similar endpoints, and at least create, some thoughtful discussion to help to improve things before we even get to that final protocol.
So how do we implement quality by design in IRT and RTSM? So we have already touched this, the collaborative, it's not coming out now, collaborative approach involving stakeholders. So the importance taken into consideration, the importance of the collaboration, because it'll make the relationship more successful. And at the end, your trials will be better and of better quality. As we've discussed, aligning the goals among sponsors, CROs, regulatory bodies, CDMOs, IRT vendors ensures a shared understanding of the trial requirements, and then the shared understanding. But as we've said, it's a collaboratory approach. So you have to bring all your different vendors in and all your stakeholders to make it more efficient and to improve the quality of your clinical trials. Yeah. So different strategies. We wanted to suggest a few different strategies for engaging with your stakeholders. So establishing clear communication channels and regular updates, the importance of joint planning sessions and shared tools, creating stakeholder engagement plans with feedback, and also utilizing digital dashboards for real-time data sharing and cross-functional workshops and training for teamwork. It's for me, and working at my company, we always try to bring our stakeholders to the table together. And then, as we've discussed already, we give them a voice. We're not just using them as our stakeholders. We are using them as our partners. So yeah, finding this balance of including them a lot of the times in the trainings makes it more efficient at the end of the day. So they are more experienced. They fully understand what you want, where you want to get, and how you want to do it. And a lot of times, okay, if you have already started writing the protocol and they come in a lot of the times a bit later on in the protocol design stage, whatever you've already decided and already written, it's good to have that workshop and training with them and including them so that they can provide feedback or recommendations more easily. Are there any other ways, Chuck, that you guys engage?
No, I really like the last point. There is something very interesting about, right, the entire working in clinical trials it's a team sport, and the ultimate sort of, again, outcome, the shared objective is getting to a regulatory submission in the most efficient, kind of compliant manner. Having people at the table already collaborating before the trial even begins is gonna, you're literally learning. All of the vendors are then learning more about the sponsor, more about each other, building trust and communication, and then maybe certain things like sharing protocol feedback or other, maybe what seem like decisions that are already fully baked, but maybe problematic. It makes it more likely that people will actually raise those issues, and maybe that they'll be heard, and that everyone can get together and set out to solve them as a group. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of power in all of that.
So we wanted to go into case studies and best practices. So here's a few real world examples to consider, or these are experiences that I've had. A study where there was a limited drug stability, which led to a redesign of the trial visit schedules. Because we had a drug that had a very short stability, we had to work to increase that stability, but because of the formulation and we had to move around the whole redesign. The drug stability is complicated if you only have a short expiry date. So we had to move around the trial visits and try to put them a bit more close to each other, and then have spaces in between and then have others later on. We also had a protocol amendment to accommodate for special storage requirements impacting the site selection. We had a study where the product was a -60 to -80 degree. I'm sorry if you hear noise in the background. And we had to do a protocol amendment because some sites did not have a -60 to -80 degree. And we had to think about packaging, shipper, kind of that could accommodate for the sites that didn't have the -80 degree. So we had to have a protocol adjustment in there to be able to include those sites to be able to do this. We then had a past trial where active engagement from clinical supplies reduced protocol amendments and delays. So we had clinical supplies. I don't know, in your companies, I have had experience where clinical supplies are brought in very late. And I've worked in biotech companies where clinical supplies are brought in early on because we're not very many. So you're in all the meetings and you can provide input. In larger companies, it might be different. So clinical supplies might come at the very end of the line. And I think clinical supplies should be at the very beginning, especially at the very first stages of the protocol design, because it might influence how you're going to design the packaging, design how the patient is going to be receiving the product. So take that into consideration. We avoided a lot of delays and didn't have any protocol amendments because we were able to implement that early on. We also had a case of enhanced packaging, reducing medication errors, especially in cell and gene therapy or radiopharmaceuticals. It's very important to think about how you're going to be providing that packaging. What are you going to put it in? Why is it so important? Is it temperature sensitive? Is it cold chain? Is it going to be moving far? Do you need a GPS logger? Is that GPS logger going to be integrated into your IRT? So those are things that you need to consider at the very beginning of your planning. Global supply chain disruptions impacting trial timelines. Nowadays, we have a lot of supply chain disruptions. We have wars, we have weather issues, we have volcanoes, we have who knows. So you have to consider all those different aspects into your considerations when you're designing your protocol, because whatever needs to go wrong or has to go wrong will go wrong. So you do always have to think in a slightly negative way to be able to identify all the risks that might occur, especially if you're going to certain countries and then when you design your IRT, you also have to consider having different supply chain options in your IRT for different countries because of different timelines, are they going to go through customs? Is it going to take longer to go through customs? It's things that you need to consider. And then integration of technology. This is in supplies tracking for data accuracy. So this could be a GPS logger, a temperature logger, but it might be how you're integrating with your EDC. What information do you want your IRT to integrate into your EDC? I know that's not necessarily related to your protocol design, but you do have to consider that. And it depends on the study and who your data manager is, because a lot of the times you might be putting a lot of information into the IRT and then this gets transferred into the EDC and you only have to do it once, whilst there's other people who want a very limited amount of information in the IRT. The patient number is triggered by the IRT and then everything else is entered into the EDC. It depends on how you want to set it up, but you do have to consider that. Adaptive supply strategies aiding trial expansion. Are you doing cooling studies? Are you doing just-in-time labeling for your clinical trials? Are you doing on-demand manufacturing? Are you custom designing your IRT? You do have to consider that early on, especially when you're doing your protocol design. What is more efficient? I know that a lot of the times especially with adaptive supply strategies, if you're pooling, in certain countries, it's harder to pool and you might be doing a hybrid approach. Also, are you doing pooling of all your products, or are you just doing pooling of your IMP, but your comparators aren't being pooled? So those are the kind of things that you need to consider. And then how are you doing your supply forecasting? Is it a strategic supply forecasting that will help you save costs? How are you doing that? A lot of the times we've noticed that from the strategic supply forecasting, we have had changes in the protocol because we've identified risks of how we were supplying our product. A complex protocol that required specialized cold chain management. I think I've already mentioned that one. That one was also related to the enhanced packaging. You might have different temperature loggers for the different cold chain management. How are those going to be integrating into your IRT? Are they going to be integrating, or are you going to be using two different softwares? And if you are using different temperature loggers and cold chain management systems, don't forget to train your sites, train your CDMOs, train your IRT vendors, train everybody on what is going to be used. Are you going to be using your IRT for the on-demand manufacturing? So a lot of the times, if there's on-demand manufacturing, you might have a customized IRT, and then you have to work with the IRT vendor really early on your design to make it more efficient, especially in radiopharmaceuticals. How changing a dose schedule partway through a trial affected the supply needs and the patient compliance. That needs to be taken into consideration. And also the benefits of redesigning a supply kit for easier patient use when you're already in the process. And so those are some of the real world examples that I have had at the different companies. I don't know, Chuck, if you have any other examples that you have encountered that could help if you would have been involved earlier.
Sure. Yeah. Everything that you had said rings true. Again, a lot of the times what we're seeing might be, basic questions around the timing of visits, logistics for maybe where certain supply needs to be shipped based on their refrigeration requirements, the feasibility of randomizing, and maybe the sequence of events of getting the investigational product to the patient in a timely manner. Maybe the interaction between lab values that are required for a manufacturing process that lead to scheduling patients and things like that. There's always a lot of little questions that come up when IRT is thinking about how it would implement those particular workflows within its system that can definitely lead to more clarity and discussion in the other topical areas that might be, regarding how the protocol itself is written, could just be other operational decisions that are being made about maybe selection or identification of different providers for other services as well. So yeah, all of these things that we're talking about here also become a checklist of items that may favor one vendor or supplier over another, just based on pure capabilities and experience, which is important when you're building the right team to actually go ahead and set up and run a particular trial.
So we have already discussed this, but how you want to distribute the units or distributing the quantities? Do you have different depots? How are you going to move? And then DNX, do not ship, do not dose, do not count. How is that going to be considered? How is your visit schedule going to be influenced? And how are your shipment quantities going to be considered? How is your depot being set up? Have you set up all your different depots, or have you set up a few? How is that going to be implemented? How are you also using ancillaries in your system or in your IRT? Or is it only the IMP that you're going to be using?
I can share, if it's helpful, a just a story from the field about a particular protocol update that actually is a little bit of a wild, maybe more extreme scenario, but it happened. There was a protocol that I had worked with in a previous life at another company 15 years ago, working through setting up a system with an entire sponsor and different suppliers, and leading up to standing up at the investigator meeting and discussing how the IRT RTSM was going to actually work. And when we got to the randomization workflow, all that happened was I merely showed that there were two choices of stratification factor, and it was the wording of those stratification that, or those strata, when I showed a drop-down menu to them, that caused the audience to almost use audible shift in their chairs as they saw an additional layer of interpretation that had been provided through different discussions around how we were, or how the sponsor was considering stratifying the study. And between the investigators and the rest of the people at the IM, it was very clear that there was a disconnect between the intention of the original protocol, the discussions with the investigators and site selection, with kind of everything downstream over something that seemed quite basic that I think everyone had leaned fully into. It really only came to light when everyone saw this example within IRT. It went to the extreme level of resulting in a protocol amendment, so that investigator meeting was actually stopped midstream. Um, and so again, that's an extreme example of not having everyone at the table early to discuss the protocol, potential, implications of certain decision making up front. But it happened.
Yeah. I've seen a number of patients changing, number of sites moving up and down. Also, countries and sometimes having issues with